We're really happy to welcome Jeff Olson. Jeff is someone that felt like a neighbor for a number of years in Saratoga Springs. At one point, I realized the amazing things he's done as an innovator and as an entrepreneur, and that he was an RPI graduate. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome Jeff here to speak with you today. Welcome, Jeff.
Part of what I want to try and talk about today, is that every one of you sitting there today is in a position where these kinds of things might happen to you. That whatever ideas you have and the vision that you've got for yourself and for what you want to accomplish, RPI can help make that possible. I can be honest in saying that when I was sitting in your seat, I didn't think that most of this would come true the way it has. It's a long story and it's not linear. And the one thing I can definitely say is I doubt that anyone in the room today has a real good, clear idea of where you're going to be in 5 years or 10 years or what career you're going to be in. Chances are you're going to be working on something that hasn't been invented yet. And hopefully what you're learning is to solve problems and to find ways to create new things that create a market for themselves. And I started as an architecture student. You'll hear a little bit about what I have done. I did get registered, licensed as an architect. I still am. Designed buildings and did all that. But most of the things that people will probably remember my career by are very different from that. And I took those opportunities to make those things happen. I've ended up involved in alternative transportation, active mobility, entirely new things that no one was talking about at the time I was in school, but they were things that I thought were important. And I lived through the worst of suburbia as a kid and lived in a place where walking and riding a bike was downright dangerous. To help pay for my time at RPI, I was flipping burgers at a suburban mall in New Jersey and having to ride my bike on the side of a freeway to go to work at night. No helmet, no way of that being safe. If any one of your parents right now knew that you were doing that this week, they would stop you from doing it, right? And yet there are some very famous people who've thought that small moments like that in their lives are important. And, what was Einstein talking about? This photo here, when he said it, it was just something I thought of while I was riding my bicycle. Anybody know the answer to that? What was Einstein thinking of? Well, it turns out it was the theory of relativity, just something he thought of while he was riding his bike. When we look at why the context for the work that I've done, particularly here in the United States, but this is true globally, as many ideas are exported from this country around the world, I think we need to invert that process and be importing ideas a whole lot more. We've seen that very much this year, and in this incredibly challenging time that we're living through here. Here we are doing this as a WebEx. I wish I was in person with you guys on campus. But a lot of the ideas that we've seen around the world during a pandemic, during this incredibly challenging time, we're seeing other countries innovate at an incredibly rapid pace. But from a land use and design perspective, many people have ended up in that sort of suburban experience I talked about. And this is the great cartoonist R. Crumb, his vision of what the landscape has been turned into in the last century of human history. And, we're somewhere in that next to the last row. It's kind of getting like it doesn't look too promising. But maybe there is some positive future out there, and let's hope that's where we're headed. So, we start to think about technology and we think about what that future could be. Everybody's got these great Jetsons TV, if anybody even gets that reference. But if you haven't, just Google the Jetsons and watch an episode on YouTube. It was this futuristic show where everybody was going to fly wherever we went and you'd be teleported and transported. The only thing that really came out of that entire era of future sci-fi was the iPhone, which actually Star Trek predicted quite well, and is one of the most spectacular things ever invented. I'm a huge fan. Whether we're going to end up in, automated flying cars, vehicles that take us where we want to go without us having any involvement, is only a partial solution to what technology can bring. Because if we all do that, we're not going to be healthier. We're not going to be physically fit. We're going to live in the same, more cars, even if they're electric or whatever they are, still is a congested environment that's not really good for people to live in. So be careful of technology and make sure you question technology always. And here's what happens, with some of that technology. I don't know how many of you have actually seen this happen in real life, but I can tell you I have more than once. And that's a pretty sad statement, that it's not good for the dog. It's not good for anyone involved in this. And while it's possible that the person driving this vehicle has a good reason for doing this, it is quite possible. But in general, the idea that you'd have to take the dog for a walk by driving a car indicates something has gone wrong. Now, I'm a pretty big music fan, and you can't Google this while we're talking, but this is a lyric from one of my favorite songs. Anybody who can, by the end of this, figure out who the artist is, what song that is, and where that song was written, will get some kind of bonus. But someday we'll look back on this, and it will all seem funny. And I really hope that's true, that we've gone through an era where we've seen society do things as recently as the last couple weeks and months. That's your guys' job. That's what we're tasking you to do. You're innovators yourselves. You're going to figure out that better world. So when I started writing the book that I wrote called The Third Mode, was about the idea that we're often stuck thinking one mode or two at a time, and we're often posing solutions to things like transportation in polar opposites. We debate whether we should spend money on highways or transit. We look at society and we have divided things so clearly and so horribly into black and white, into rich and poor, into Democrat and Republican, in ways that don't really make any sense. When you get down to it, we're missing the ability to think in multiple intelligences, in multiple solutions. And that was the idea of the third mode, that there'd be this other way of looking at the solutions to problems that might combine things in ways that we haven't. And you're doing that, some of you with multidisciplinary degrees and programs that are cutting across the borders of things that are borders we should have never had in the first place. There's no reason why an architect like myself can't also be an entrepreneur, why you couldn't also be doing engineering or computer science or environmental science and merging those things together. So, what I created, that paradox, was based on, and there's a chapter in the book, I won't tell you the whole story, but when someone said to me that what I was really trying to do was to create a third mode, that there's only going to be highway funding and transit funding, we're never going to do anything else. And I said, in fact, that is exactly what I am trying to do, is to get people to think, look, if a bus has a bike rack on it and goes down a road, is that highways or transit, or is it biking, and why does it matter? It shouldn't at all make a difference, right? We just need people to be mobile. Our diet is the same thing. If you think of the food pyramid, the base of it being the healthy grains that you eat, transportation, it's the same thing. We have to start from pedestrians first, the thing that uses the least energy and gives us the most benefit that the most people can do, and then build the rest of the system from that. And it's the same as your diet. So hopefully you're eating healthy while you're in school. When we begin to think that way, and if that third mode thinking, and I'm going to use transportation as the basis of this talk today, we start to rethink the way cities get built from the ground up. We change the public space that people are in. And if you want to see one of the most exciting innovations that's happened during this pandemic, and it's been forced to happen, but it has responded well, has been the changing use of streets as public space. Because streets make up the majority of public acreage in every city on Earth right now. And the world's cities are growing faster and faster. We're at a point where the world's population is more than 50% urban. This is the problem that cities have to solve, is how to efficiently use that space well. And do we create more space for people walking and biking and sitting and eating and social distancing and physically distancing, and then still also being able to run buses and whatever vehicles we're going to have and make those happen in that public space? And when we look at that 50% urban world, this is the reality of what's happening. This is a city called Curitiba, Brazil. I'm not sure how many of those in this class would already have heard of Curitiba. They're one of the most sustainable cities on Earth. They have a transit system that carries half of the people in their 3 million person city every single day. It's run on sugarcane-based ethanol that they grow. The rest of the city's energy is coming from wind and solar and biomass. And this street in particular was created by their mayor, a man named Jaime Lerner, in 3 days. And it became known as the 72-hour street. They started on Friday afternoon. It was a 4-lane highway. On Monday, it opened it up as a pedestrian space through the center of their city. And this was done a decade ago. We're just beginning here in this country to start to think that way. And that global competition is something we are all in. I've had, I guess, the good fortune and the opportunity in my career as I said, I started off doing buildings. I really wanted to be doing green architecture and sustainability at a time when there wasn't a market for that. I had a hard time finding clients that wanted a passive solar house in the early 1980s, and architecture had largely become a fashion show. So it was all about, can I take a piece of paper and twist it up and drop it on the floor, and then build that out of titanium and build some really shiny, wonderful thing, which is nothing wrong with that. It's kind of great, but does that solve some societal problem? And I started to shift more and more into urban and regional planning, and found transportation was where the money was. There was a massive transportation bill passed in the early 1990s that created more than $1 billion a year in projects for walking, bicycling, trails, urban space, and a market that went from nothing to $1 billion a year. That seemed to be a good place to be. And at the time, I was sent down to New York City on behalf of New York State to begin transforming the urban environment around walking and bicycling. This group of people and others helped create a fund in the 1990s that built more than $100 million in projects for infrastructure. And if you stood right around Chelsea Piers in Manhattan right now, that's just about where this photo was taken. It obviously is a dated enough photo. You can see the World Trade Center in the background. We met there every month to help plan that program for 5 years in the mid-1990s. And this group of people are unsung heroes that most people will never know their names, but they're out there. They know what they did. And if you're on the West Side right now, it's part of their work. And that ended up creating a 350-mile greenway system for New York City that became one of the models for cities across the country and around the world. My partners, I began a consulting company with my partners in Portland, Oregon, and Berkeley, California. I was the 8th employee. This was in 2009, a pretty memorable meeting for us because it was standing at the condo that we're pictured in front of in Palm Springs, California, at a tennis tournament. A couple of us are tennis players, and we're really excited we could go see Nadal play that day. And it was fantastic. Michael Jones in the red there had this idea that in addition to all the urban design work we were doing, we should start a bike share company. And that was the day it started. Something that none of us really knew how to do, but it had just begun to happen in a couple cities around the world, particularly Paris and Montreal. And we became the owners of the largest bike share fleet in North America, one of the largest operators in the world. We went from nothing, from 0 employees with Alta Bike Share to more than 500 employees in 5 years. We ran more than 30 million rides on our bike share systems in cities like New York and Chicago, San Francisco, Seattle, Washington, D.C., Boston, Toronto, Melbourne, Australia. And then the company was acquired by a very large real estate entity in New York City, the group that built Hudson Yards, and was subsequently sold by them to Lyft. That's a lot to say in one sentence, but all of that actually happened to an alumni architect from RPI and a group of partners who had never done anything like what we did, had no background in doing it, started this entity from scratch while we were still running our design company, which had its own 200 employees and 20-something offices by that time. And by the way, I also taught urban planning at UAlbany during those years. I was doing all those things at the same time, and as a father of 3, raising 3 kids with my wife, which, looking backwards, sounds like it probably wasn't even possible. I urge you to make sure you find that work-life balance early and don't lose track of it. And the moment you do, it is time to exit out if you can. But I love this photo because this literally was Citibike number 1, 0001, you can see on it. And I had the great pleasure of getting to ride it. And that started a trend and a movement that was far bigger than anything we could have imagined. It became so iconic. You've seen the Jon Stewart video. We became celebrities, but we also had to deal with some major problems. The growth of a company like that and the technology along with it is a longer story than we have today, but I'll touch on some parts of it. What we had to do was a lot of hard work. I can't even begin to describe. Imagine that we were creating Hertz rental car and we were getting Fords to run them. And that was really what we were trying to do. Fleets of vehicles that needed to operate in public space that people were renting, in this case, for a short-term period of time, and thousands of them in multiple cities with hundreds of stations, hundreds of people in incredibly complicated urban environments, and it had to all look simple, right? But I will never say at any point in my life that any of it was simple. It was extremely complex. A lot of fun, but very complex. We had all kinds of technical problems we had to overcome. And for you electrical engineers and software folks, there are links here. You can go back and see some of the things that happened. But the central problem was that the company that we bought all this equipment from, the stations, the bikes, etc., our vendor, our Ford, if you will, to our Hertz, ended up going bankrupt in the middle of what we were doing. And they went bankrupt because they made one of the most catastrophically bad business decisions in the history of bad business decisions. They had a perfectly working product that we were using at that point in Melbourne, in Boston, in Washington, D.C., and it worked great. But they were in a position where they needed to, they were started as a public entity in the city of Montreal. They were ordered by the courts to become a private entity in order to be able to sell their product outside of Quebec. And in the process of doing that, they got rid of the group that had written their software, their base code, and hired in some outsiders, said, just replicate this. It's going to work fine. And it completely failed. They failed to rewrite that software. They failed to correct the problems that they created. And as we went to launch in New York City, the biggest bike share system in the world at the time, it completely failed. And we were stuck with that mess on our hands. So you can't imagine how difficult that was. That mess led us to have to delay the launch for 6 months. That delay was until October of that year. And in October of that year, what happens? Go to the next slide. Just to think, it couldn't get worse. And it does. We stored the entire system that we had paid for in a very nicely arranged waterfront warehouse arranged by the city in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, fast growing tech zone. And roughly $20 million of equipment was in that warehouse the night that Hurricane Sandy hit. We had 11 feet of seawater go through the building with solar panels and electronics and bikes that had lights and other elements of them that salt water destroyed. We couldn't find things like forklifts after the storm. We had tried our best to keep that from happening, stack things up farther than we thought would be a problem on pallets, and the building was destroyed along with most of the waterfront. So you never think you're going to go through something like that, right? And certainly as a business person, as an entrepreneur, you try to game plan everything and tabletop exercises and every possible scenario. No one had ever prepared us for the idea that our biggest project ever, something bigger than anyone had attempted, led by the mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, and the chairman of Citibank, okay? We're not dealing with small players here, would get destroyed in a hurricane on the Brooklyn waterfront, right? What scenario is that, right? And we had to dig ourselves back out of that hole, not to mention fix the broken software. Next. As you know, we did not do well during that period. It was extremely difficult. This is an actual email we got. It is one of my favorites ever. I think we can read this if this is being recorded. But it starts off by saying, "Who is the gigantic ass clown moron who just put 40 bike stalls directly in front of the building I live in the middle of New York City? You suck." And it goes on from there. It ends by saying, what a waste of time and money, time and space and money this project is. You guys suck beyond belief. Well, as I said earlier, sometimes humor is your best possible reaction in challenging times, and that was mine. I thought that was the funniest phrase I'd ever heard. They call this gigantic ass clown morons, and I thought that was a great name for a rock band. So immediately, my partners and I were, emailing back and forth. Who's the bass player? Who's the roadie? And I designed and made touring T-shirts for the whole company of the gigantic ass clown morons 2013-2014 tour. I listed the tour dates down the back of every city that we were in, and those became collectibles. That was just so much fun. You have to take it on the chin. The technology was failing. We got hit by a hurricane. We're 6 months behind in delivering the system. The mayor has promised this to the people of the city of New York. It's our job to fix that problem, right? And there are other parts of it that went wrong I won't go into today. But we do manage to get to the point where we launched the system in June of 2013. And it's an instantaneous success in spite of all the technology problems until, as you saw, we get attacked by the Wall Street Journal. Again, I'm an architecture student. I'm working in a design company. We've created this startup thing that's going to do bike share, which we don't know how to do and have never done before, nor has anybody else. And we're getting attacked by the Wall Street Journal. I mean, how do you fight that? Well, it turns out Jon Stewart knew exactly how to, and with no prompting that I've ever been able to find, this episode, Full Pedal Racket, shows up on the night of June 6, 2013, and literally saves the company. It saves our future. It saves bike share as we know it. It changes the trajectory of cities all over the world by getting everyone to laugh at the Wall Street Journal, as you saw, and it is pretty funny, getting everybody to laugh at all the complaints and problems and arguments about why this thing wasn't going to work. It shows up on the cover of the New Yorker. We end up with Paul McCartney on Saturday Night Live gives us a shout out. Beyonce rides one of the bikes. DiCaprio rides one of the bikes. The next thing we know, we are instant celebrities, and all of a sudden, bike share is the media darling. So it went from as dark as it's going to get to the sun is out, and we are having a great time. And it was a rocket ship ride from there on. I'm saying this, obviously, I'm pretty happy sitting here now. The Miss Universe or Miss Teen pageant, maybe both of them at some point, came to us and said, can we do public service announcements using the city bikes? Because this is the most fun we've ever had in New York City. Can you imagine getting an email like that? We had Jay-Z's production company wanted to do the opening credits of the movie Annie with Annie on a city bike. We didn't even know how to respond. We were so busy, solving major technical problems that all of a sudden we had to create a program of good things that were suddenly happening, right? It didn't get any better for me until that summer. My son puts on Sharknado 2, for his sisters, right? And we're watching Sharknado 2, and the opening credits, they're at Citi Field. There's a ball game going on. And Isaac says, Dad, if they're at Citi Field, that's just product placement. Wait a minute, I bet they have city bikes in this movie. And sure enough, there's a scene. They come racing out of the subway. They're being chased by the sharks. I hope you guys have all seen Sharknado. They come racing out of the subway. They go running down the street. They take out MasterCard, one of our sponsors. They're holding a MasterCard. And they come across one of the bike share docks, and it says MasterCard, Citibank on it. They swipe the card, and they ride away from the sharks. Okay? It's never going to get any better than that. But it did. We end up being the largest operator of bike share on the planet at the time, quickly eclipsed, by the way, with systems in China and other countries that did what we did at even greater scale, bigger, better, faster. And we knew that was coming. We were well aware of how fast this industry was going to grow, but we hit our stride. We were able to get all these other systems up and running. As I said, we reached 30 million trips and 0 fatalities. I think that's probably the most significant combination of numbers that I can say. In spite of all the fear and stuff that people were going to have, people absolutely love this stuff. And I still, to this day, constantly get images of people, selfies, hey, look, we're still on one of your bikes. And that just brings total and complete joy to me. Somebody mentioned earlier, I'm definitely not a Boston sports fan, but having a row of those Hubway bikes at the Garden in Boston is pretty exciting. For me, much more exciting to see them at the Garden in New York City. And people are still using them all the way through the pandemic. Ridership has grown. This is part of a major movement about how cities are changing in response to not just this year, but what's going on and the trends of the future. And it is rapidly growing and continues to grow. Chicago, same thing. And it just gives you a sense that every city we were in. And then we get to the point where we get an unsolicited offer to sell the entire company, and very, very happily exited out, which was, that's why I'm smiling right now. That's why I'm sitting here able to do this today. I have also since left my former partnership with Alta Planning and Design, which was our other company. I am pretty much free to do things like, I just had a big birthday with a 0 in it, and I am skiing that number of days this year. I can tell you I've skied a lot, and I skied today. I have total and complete control of my time. I get to work on things that are fun and interesting. I have a couple other startups going on right now. I get to meet and work with groups of students like you in this class, and it's total joy. So I don't want to understate how difficult some of it was, and there were some really, really difficult things that we had to go through, but that light at the end of the tunnel was not an oncoming train. And you can go to these links and see the end of the story ends very well. There's our same partnership group a few years later, and that's the bottom line. We ran a company that went from nothing to 500 employees in 5 years' time. We ran 30 million trips with 0 fatalities on a system that had never been tested at that scale, in cities that had never seen this kind of mobility, and with major sponsorship from not just Citibike, but New Balance in Boston and many others that were part of this, that created an entire iconic movement. And something as iconic as the yellow taxi cab or the T or the subway, from out of nowhere, from a group of people that didn't have expertise in fleet management. My partners are landscape architects, economists, planners, engineers. I was the lone architect in that group, and yet we figured out how to hire really smart people. We figured out how to scale up using the best of what we could find from many other people and many other resources. We were smart enough to know what we didn't know and how to bring those resources to bear. We learned on the fly. We were very quick to respond in many ways because we had nothing to lose, and everything to gain. And we knew very quickly we were onto something that was going to be great. This is the mayor of Philadelphia, a couple of our staff and friends of mine riding with him. That didn't happen 10 years ago. It didn't happen prior to what bike share changed. Mayors didn't go out and ride around and say, hey, this is a really great thing. We should be doing a lot more of this. I am now an advisor to the board of the World Resources Institute. As one of their advisors, I can tell you, we just sat through a 3-day event with them with the World Bank that I'm part of every year. Every city in the world that was part of that conference was talking about active mobility as a critical part of pandemic response, as a critical part of building back better, about how to move the future of their cities. Again, that wasn't happening 10 years ago. And the opportunities now are probably even bigger than they were. I want you to just get a sense, though, that there's a lot else going on and that this wasn't the only thing that myself and my partners did. And I also want to make sure you understand that any project I've talked about involved many, many, many people. You don't do any of this stuff yourself. And you shouldn't ever take the credit for it either. It is the work of many, many hands. But we've seen scooter share almost overtaking bike share. We're seeing projects like my friend George and our California team at Alta, CV Link, great project to take a look at, which is an entirely new regional pathway system. That's CV is Coachella Valley Link, all based on technology that is solar powered, electric mobility for the entire region. And they're building this from the ground up, state of the art design. And again, these models are evolving faster and faster. Every week there's something new. And, just to bring it home and back to New York State, this is a project that just finished and was sort of my last project with my former partners, the Empire State Trail. We took an idea that had been kind of starting to happen over many years, and with tremendous leadership from Governor Cuomo, produced a more than $200 million program that connected across the state from end to end and border to border. And as an RPI alum, and knowing that RPI's foundation goes back to the days of the Erie Canal and to the Roeblings and building the great bridges, we were able to help engineer and design a pathway system that now goes from Albany to Buffalo, from New York City to Montreal. You can get out and ride it right now. If you are in or near campus, you're within a couple miles of it. You can see sections of it pretty much across the entire state. And every one of these projects was an extremely difficult, virtually impossible to build project. People said, we're never going to do this. New York State's trail system will never fully connect because all these projects are too hard to do. Our answer to that was, what if we just did them all at once? And 54 different capital projects, more than $200 million, all done at the same time in 3 years during a pandemic. And the governor made the announcement on December 31st that the project is complete. That was my last day of work with Alta and on to this next phase of my life. So don't let people say that the things you want to try to accomplish cannot be done, because they can be done. They just might be difficult. And the reward of doing something that's been difficult is infinite. I know that for the rest of my life, every time I get out and go for a ride anywhere in New York State, I'm only going to be a few miles away from this incredible system. It's projected that more than 8.5 million people a year are going to use this. You can go from Battery Park in Manhattan all the way to Buffalo, and I am planning on doing that myself beginning the second Sunday in May. Looking forward to it, because now I have the time and the ability to go do the things that, maybe I've always wanted to do. So, just to not ever say that you're done, because nobody ever really is, and your work will hopefully be your whole life. One of the startups involved right now is a company called Recharge. As shared mobility has grown and bikes and scooters and wheelchairs and dozens of other things are electrifying, the question is, how does that stuff get charged up? And right now, companies like Lyft and Uber that are in that business are having people bring scooters into their homes or drive trucks around and swap batteries. Well, I've been working with a partner, a friend of mine who's a physicist from France. We have found a way to wirelessly charge those devices in public space. We have our first working prototype is about to get displayed in the next month. And again, we've been doing this work during a pandemic with tremendous support from New York State Energy, NYSERDA. And we are very close to beginning to bring that product to market. And you'll be able to just cruise through a city, When your thing needs to be charged up, you'll pull up to one of these docks. You don't have to plug anything in. It'll charge itself. And while you're there, you can charge your iPhone or charge some other device that you might be using. We think this is going to really revolutionize the way people live, work, and play in cities as much as the other things we've talked about before. So that's just one of the fun things I'm working on right now. I'm writing another book. I'm doing a lot of skiing. I'm going to be doing a lot of biking. But you're always looking for that next thing and wanting to see another project happen. And that's the excitement of, back to what I said at the beginning, learning to solve problems, learning to see opportunities, being willing to take some risk, and learning that there are other people out there who believe the same thing you do, enough to want to join you in that effort. And they're smarter than you are, they're faster than you are, they're capable in ways that you could never imagine. And it's a matter of building great teams to make that happen. I did have to just throw this in here. One of the things I didn't talk about that I did was I ran a national program for the White House. So I did spend some time in DC. These are not cardboard cutouts. Those are actually real people who I did work with. And I used that slide for another reason, is that on that day, I had worked about, I don't even know how many hours to get this particular event to happen. I had not seen my daughter I love this picture because she just jumped up into my arms in the middle of us doing this thing. And we got the First Lady of the United States, the Transportation Secretary. That's Harriet Fulbright from the Fulbright program, second in from the left. And my daughter was like, didn't want to let go. And we're supposed to do this photo op. And I just turned to the First Lady and I said, what do you want me to do? She said, hold on to her. That's going to make a great photo. And I'll never forget that moment, because here's a very top level leader recognizing what was so important at that moment wasn't us taking that picture. It was all of us being together as a team, and that our kids are part of that, and that we are family working together. And just wanted to use that image because there are tough times and you have to work your way through them. So if you want to reach me, there's email and cover the book. Let's try to take some questions.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm a mechanical engineer and aspiring entrepreneur. I just had a question. How do you think the pandemic has, as an observer at this point, how do you think the pandemic has changed the ride-sharing industry as a whole? And what strategies do you see being put in place going forward that have been the most effective?
Well, I think there are a couple of transformations happening. It's a great question. One is huge investments have happened because people do see this. The investment money is still going. There's been more VC capital invested in electric micromobility, and that would be scooters, bikes, et cetera, in the last 10, 12 months during the pandemic, because people are realizing that if I'm riding a bike or using a scooter or walking in urban space, I have a chance to physically distance myself. I don't have that same opportunity using almost any other form of mobility. And at the same time, cities, as I said, have been rethinking how their public space is allocated and creating much, much more space for people walking, biking, and using that micromobility. So if you look at the simplest measure I could use would be Copenhagen right now has about 50% of all trips are done by bicycle. It's extraordinary, right? It rivals anything in the world. New York City, on a good day, pre-pandemic, was probably at about 2%, which means there's 25x growth possible to get from where New York is to where Copenhagen is. And if all of us now are realizing finally that climate change is for real, and if we come out of the pandemic and the economic problem and the racial problem that we're having, we hopefully can solve those. All of those have to happen within a context of climate change, because getting through those only leads us to the bigger one. And climate change is going to radically transform this world. If we are going to create greener cities, everybody's realizing that's what this is. So that opportunity for shared mobility, I think, will continue to shift away from just shared cars, which has been where it started, and really focus on ways that people can get around regardless of what the pandemic situation is, in a way that every city in the world can use. And I think we're going to see huge growth in micromobility as a result. Great question. Next, please.
Hi, Jeff. Quick question. So do you think that the dockless model that a lot of the companies in the scooter share industry implements, do you think that's good for cities?
Here's a great question. For those of you following this stuff as closely as Richard is, originally bike share came to docks, and originally those docks were hardwired into the electrical grid in Paris. Montreal's system, which we used a lot of, was solar powered, which meant those docks could then be relocated easily and didn't require digging up the street to put them in. Then systems came along, particularly scooter based, where an app let you unlock that device and you could get a bike or a scooter without having to dock it anywhere. The problem became that those bikes and scooters literally did end up everywhere. And they became sort of urban litter. And a lot of cities, including New York, wouldn't even allow scooters to happen because they could not control where they were going to end up. Competing companies, you've seen all kinds of video about this online, would come around, pick up their opponents' devices and throw them in the river. People would prank them. All kinds of stuff would happen. And the charging problem remains that you've got to find these things and get the batteries to work. So when I talked about recharge before, what we're trying to do is bring all that back together. If there's a logical place where they get charged up, and we can do that wirelessly across any platform. So we're agnostic to whoever's devices they are. We just want to be able to have the charging space. Then there's a reason for those docks to happen. Even if they're not physically locking the device, there's a reason for those electric devices to come back to a given point, which organizes them in public space, provides the charging infrastructure, and creates more urban order, which has been a clear issue. So I would think the dockless systems did very, very well for a little while, but as electric micromobility really becomes the trend, it's going to be very hard if they remain dockless and still have to be charged somehow. So that's what we're betting on. Good question.
Thanks for your insight.
Next, please. Keep going, guys.
To what extent do you think that these innovations that are happening in an urban environment can also have sort of benefits outside of urban environments?
Oh, very much so. And even small towns like where I live in Saratoga Springs, one of my favorite clients, and you can read about them in the book as well, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a town of 11,000 people, is transforming themselves. And they're a resort destination. But many small towns are realizing the same thing, that if we only talk about the public health aspect of this and the need to be both mentally and physically healthy, it is absolutely critical that we get as much exercise as we can. And that's not true just during the pandemic. That's true in general. We were dealing with an obesity and physical inactivity pandemic over the last 10 years anyway. And that's a global problem that we still have not solved. So the idea that we need more physical activity and that relates to the design of our communities is equally true on a rural small town Main Street as it is on Broadway in Manhattan. So I think there's a very strong connection between this work, and have done a lot of that work in urban, suburban, and rural environments. And that's true globally as well. You're going to see those shift from rural to urban, but there's still an equal need for people living in urban areas if we're going to continue to provide food and water and energy for the rest of the world. And this is something I genuinely enjoy doing. I can't tell you how much of a treat this is for me to be able to see you guys and have this conversation, and to hear that you're engaged about these things just means the world to me. So keep going.
I guess I can ask one. Are you taking a loss on, like, is like when you first started, or as of now, like, have you ever taken like losses on bikes? Like, was like the amount that you spent repairing and replacing lost bikes or broken bikes more than the amount that you were getting from the actual service itself?
That's a great question. It's a difficult one to answer because what happened with the Montreal company that supplied most of our bikes was a software problem that caused all kinds of delays and other problems. When Hurricane Sandy hit, one of the things we had to deal with was our insurance company refused to pay the amount of money for our damages. They basically said, "You guys are a small business, sue us." Now, we did 3 years later, and we won that lawsuit. But that was 3 years of us floating this thing on our credit cards, right? Not an easy thing to do. So there were losses that were associated with catastrophic events, with all the software problems, but the bikes themselves and the locking mechanism and the urban design quality of that system was extraordinary. It was the better mousetrap. It was, and that's why that company's failure is so hard to accept. They designed the stations and the bikes incredibly, and they ended up with a major software problem that did cause significant financial hardship. But had that not happened, and maybe you never get to say that, right? You just have to anticipate there would be losses caused by just about anything. These systems have been extremely successful and very profitable. And that's why they've spawned a new generation of them that are continuing to try to build upon that model. Entities, though, like Lyft and Uber appear to be and others, OFO from China and others have tried to do this, flood the market with tens of thousands of their scooters, hope to capture that market at a loss, and then someday begin to make money. That's happening too, but we did not ever operate that way. Great business question. There's a question in the chat I just wanted to address. How much of our success was due to luck and how much by the team? I have a good friend of mine who has always said this to me: it isn't luck. You make your luck happen. And to be honest, maybe we were fortunate and we were in the right place at the right time, but I would give the credit 110% to the team. We had some lucky things happen. Certainly people like John Stewart didn't even know they were helping us when they did, but you create those opportunities. Thanks to the Lally School for doing this. It is really great to be able to give back. It is a complete joy, and I'm very happy to do it. So thank you all. Good luck with whatever ventures you're working on. I hope this was useful to you.
Nice. Thanks, Jeff.